On this episode of Weekend Spin, Paul McCartney is going to get mugged. He's going to pass out.
Oh no!
He's going to be accused of cultural appropriation. But he will also produce one of the most celebrated albums of his entire career.
Yay!
Hello, this is TJR, and if this is your first time here, welcome to the channel. If not, welcome back. Released in November of 1973, Band on the Run is the third studio album from Paul McCartney and Wings, but it is also his fifth studio album after leaving the Beatles. Sales-wise, it would open modestly until two hit singles made it the top-selling studio album of 1974. Unlike Paul McCartney's previous four albums, which were met with middling to fair reviews, Band on the Run would be met with mostly positive responses from critics. And it is now considered to be one of his most celebrated post-Beatle releases. But the road to Band on the Run was not without some adversity. At the outset, Paul McCartney had decided he needed a change of scenery, and he wanted to record someplace outside of England. So he looked up a list of recording studios owned by his record label, and of all the locations, he chose the one in Lagos, Nigeria, simply because it felt like the most exotic and not like England place that his label EMI owned a studio in. And from here, his struggles began. Before leaving London for Lagos, drummer Danny Sewell and guitarist Henry McCullough would quit over creative differences and because they didn't want to go to Africa. Down two players, it was now just Paul, guitarist Denny Laine, and his wife Linda. This meant Paul was going to have to do a lot of double duty, playing multiple instruments, but mostly it meant that Paul McCartney would have to do all the drums himself. In interviews, he has stated that if you listen carefully, you will hear that the drums are quite simple. For years, I honestly never realized this, but now that I've listened closely, I have to admit it's true. The drums are simple, but they work. And I will circle back to why they work when I get to track 5, Let Me Roll It. Arriving in Africa, Paul, Linda, and Denny found the studio to be not even close to the standard that any of them were used to, and that even simple things like reliable electricity were a problem. For a brief time, Paul McCartney did flirt with the idea of bringing in local Nigerian musicians, believing it might give the album some added spark. But he quickly nixed the idea after he was criticized for wanting to steal their local sounds for his album. During one recording session, he stepped out to get some air and passed out. He would end up having to be taken to a hospital. He recovered, and the local doctors advised him to stay away from the local weed. And on another evening, he and Linda would actually get mugged at knife point, with the thieves not only stealing their money and camera, but also Paul's demo tapes and handwritten lyrics. I've always wondered if those ever turned up anywhere, but I have never heard anything about them. So I guess the thieves had no idea who they were mugging, and that those demos and lyrics have been lost to time. But through it all, the three of them soldiered on. In a TV interview, Paul stated that he was lucky to have been able to remember all those songs that he demoed after losing those tapes. But he also mentioned that having those two guys quit the band like they did really fired him up into a, well, I'll show you kind of attitude. I'll record an album that you'll both be sorry you weren't part of. And I sometimes think that it was that frame of mind that got him through a great deal of the adversity he faced during the 6 weeks of recording those basic tracks. After which, he went back to England and George Martin's AIR studios to record final instrumental and vocal overdubs, including the orchestral sections conducted by longtime David Bowie collaborator Tony Visconti. And it was during this time that former Derry and the Seniors member Howie Casey, who would also end up working with Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins, would end up playing saxophone on tracks like Jet, Bluebird, and Mrs. Vanderbilt. So with all that said, let's dive into the music. Side 1, Track 1, Band on the Run. Make no mistake, This is a pop rock epic. If it were a play, it would be broken up into 3 acts. Act 1. Band on the Run opens with what is sometimes referred to as a musical conversation, or, as it is better known, call out and response. In Band on the Run, the call out and response opens with the electric guitar doing the call out and the synthesizer giving us the response. Now, during this part, there is some overlapping between the 2 instruments with the notes that they're playing. And for this demonstration, since I don't have 4 hands and I only have 1 instrument here, I'm going to do a little bit of necessary editing so that it all fits together, but I think you'll still get the idea. It's interesting, once you take away the distortion on the electric guitar and play it on the piano and take out the bass notes, it sounds very Eastern. After the instrumental opening, the call out and response continues, but now it's between the lead vocal and the synthesizer. Stuck inside this four walls, sent inside forever. There is a little slide guitar riff after the first verse that really sends this song into the stratosphere before it comes crashing down into the key of A minor. And it's this part that is the second act. And then we go from this very ethereal, dreamlike section into this heavy guitar riff. If I ever get out of here, thought of giving it all away to a registered charity. All I need is a pint a day. You know, we all tend to get very religious when we're in dire straits or in deep trouble. And the line about giving it all away to a registered charity is definitely about that. You're basically pleading, please God, if you get me out of this, I'll do better. I promise. This takes us to Act 3, and we transition into the key of C major. Well, the rain exploded with a mighty crash as we fell into the sun. And you know, you can feel that foreshadowed in the musical break that precedes that lyric. As an example, that's the thunder and lightning. And that's the rain. It sounds like rain, don't you think? Again, growing up, I used to imagine that the jail referenced in the song was this very small, tiny local jail in some old western town, and that with the rain came lightning, and that the lightning played a hand in breaking our heroes out of their cell. And the first one said to the second one there, I hope you're having fun. This line really paints a cinematic picture of a jailbreak scene. It's right out of a 70s action film that is tempered with a good dose of comedy. A film like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would be a good example. And the jailer man and Sailor Sam were searching every one. Over the years, I have found a number of Beatles songs that have what I call a very nursery rhyme-like quality of the lyrics. And I can read a through line from those songs when I read lines like, and the jailer man and Sailor Sam in this one. By the way, I did post a previous video on this topic, and I'll leave a link in case you're interested. Quite frankly, I view Band on the Run as being in the same vein as A Day in the Life, the long medley on Abbey Road by the Beatles, and also in the vein of Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey off of Ram. which, by the way, I did do a weekend spin on also, in case you haven't seen it. But I would like to point out that the main difference between Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, and Band on the Run is that Uncle Albert is much more dreamlike, whereas Band on the Run is much more epic and immediate sounding. Track 2, Jet. You know, the first track, Band on the Run, has a through line, a story you can follow. Jet doesn't. Jet, I can almost remember their funny faces. That time you told them that you were going to be marrying soon. And Jet, I thought the only lonely place was on the moon. These are very whimsical lyrics, and McCartney has always been very good at writing this sort of thing. Was your father as bold as a sergeant major? Well, how come he told you that you are hardly old enough yet? And Jet, I thought the major was a lady, suffragette. Again, I need to point out how fun and playful these lyrics are. When you hear McCartney sing, and Jet, I thought the major was a lady, Jet sounds like a person, place, or thing. But when I read it, and Jet, I thought the major was a lady, it's like he's playing with words. Instead of saying, and yet, I thought the major was a lady, he's substituting the word yet with jet, then ending it with suffragette. I have no idea what any of this means, but it sure sounds profound. In one interview, Paul McCartney has stated that the song's title is inspired by a dog that he and Linda once owned. But in another interview, he says it was inspired by a horse they once owned. But then why does he call out the women's rights movement of the early 20th century? Later, in a 2017 radio interview, he stated that the song is actually about meeting Linda's father for the first time and feeling a bit intimidated about it. I have heard a lot of banter about all of this, but honestly, I don't think any of it really matters all that much. I think he just really liked how the word jet sounded with the rest of the song, so he kept it. At the end of the day, Jet is just a very fun, straightforward rock and roll song. One personal note. Growing up with this song, I always thought that McCartney's repeated line, I thought the major was a lady, was kind of just a play on Lovely Rita, Meet Her Maid, getting hot for a woman in uniform. In retrospect, I could almost say that Jet might have fitted very nicely on Ram too because of its lyrics, but musically it doesn't feel quite loose enough. Either way, Jet provides a very simple, straightforward counterpoint to the epic song that had just preceded it. On track 3, we get to catch our breath with Bluebird.
I'm a bluebird, I'm a bluebird, I'm a bluebird, I'm a bluebird.
Growing up, I always looked at this song as a kind of continuation to Blackbird off the White Album, or at least a second cousin to it. But whereas Blackbird employs some of McCartney's most technical guitar playing, Bluebird employs some very easygoing strumming patterns accompanied by a light calypso beat. There were times, of course, when I also wondered if perhaps Paul McCartney didn't take some inspiration from the song Hummingbird by Seals and Croft off their 1972 album Summer Breeze. Released roughly 1 year prior to Band on the Run, Hummingbird hit radio charts during the early part of 1973. So there is some possibility that he might have heard it and took some inspiration. Both songs are melodically completely different, but they both use the bird as a symbol. McCartney uses it as a symbol for love, while Seals and Croft use it as a symbol for faith. But both songs use it as a symbol for being free. Next to the album's title track, I personally find Bluebird to be the second best song on the album. It is a home run, out of the ballpark winner. I especially want to point out that just before the song ends, there is this little musical walkdown at the 3-minute mark where all the notes are played discordant with each other. I find this section to be absolutely brain-melting in the best possible way. And every time I hear it, I think to myself, how did he come up with that? Side note, in the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, the book's protagonist, Arthur Dent, observes an ancient alien race whose planet is called Cricket. Yes, it's called Cricket. And they all have an amazing talent for music. I'm going to read a little passage here for you. Night had now fallen on ancient Cricket. A small group of people were walking home across the hill towards the town, actually singing a song about how terribly nice everything was. Arthur could almost imagine Paul McCartney sitting with his feet up by the fire one evening, humming the song to Linda and wondering what to buy with the proceeds, and thinking probably Essex. Arthur saw that a couple members of the party were now singing a different tune. It came lilting back to them through the soft night air, and was a sweet romantic ballad that would have netted McCartney Kent and Sussex, and enabled him to put in a fair offer for Hampshire. From somewhere at the back of the crowd, a single voice started to sing a tune which would have enabled Paul McCartney, had he written it, to buy the world. You know, when I first read that line, I always thought that song that the aliens were singing must have sounded like either Another Day or Bluebird. Things start to pick up a bit with track 4, Mrs. Vanderbilt. In somewhat the same way that John Lennon borrowed a line from Chuck Berry for the opening of Come Together, Paul McCartney borrowed a catchphrase from English comedian and performer Charlie Chester for the opening of Mrs. Vanderbilt. Chester's catchphrase was, "Down in the jungle, living in a tent, better than a bungalow, no rent," was changed to, "Down in the jungle, living in a tent, you don't use money, you don't pay rent. You don't even know the time, but you don't mind." This, of course, is followed by a long string of hey-hos. No, not those. These are hey-hos, not hi-hos. Hi-ho, it's home. No. And all of these hey-hos are the reason why the casual fan might refer to the song as hey-ho. And honestly, I wouldn't blame you. After all, you don't even hear a mention of Mrs. Vanderbilt till the song's bridge. When your light is on the blink, you never think of worrying. What's the use of worrying? When your bus has left the stop, you'd better drop. You're hurrying. What's the use of hurrying? To be sure, Mrs. Vanderbilt is totally ear candy, and you might think it's just a bunch of fun musical silliness. Or is it? The lyrics have a certain childlike whimsy quality that, again, is common in both McCartney and Beatles songs. But on closer inspection, I have to admit that they are not without a certain philosophical bent regarding the importance of stopping to smell the roses. Nothing mind-blowing, to be sure, but it's these lyrical touches that keep the song from being devoid of any meaning. Or, to use the food analogy, it's not completely empty calories. Track 5. Let Me Roll It. Another favorite of mine. Let me roll it. The line, "Let Me Roll It," is taken from George Harrison's I'd Have You Any Time off of All Things Must Pass, released in 1970.
Let me roll it to you.
It's the last line of lyric of the first verse in I'd Have You Any Time, but here, McCartney elevates it to the song's title and repeat chorus. And you can hear a through line of a song like this in songs like Don't Let Me Down and Oh Darling. In interviews, Paul has described the tape echo effect used on the vocals as similar to the kind of effects John liked to hear on his own studio vocals. But honestly, you can trace this vocal sound back to artists like Gene Vincent and the birth of rock and roll. What makes this song stand out, though, is its heavy blues rock guitar riff and how it interrupts and juxtaposes against the song's otherwise mellow flow. Doing this brings the song into what was then a modern context, and without it, it would just be a throwback song to the late 50s and early 60s. Personally, I never get tired of the song, and I guess neither does McCartney, since it's been a regular staple of his live shows over the decades. Speaking of which, Remember how I talked about McCartney playing all the drum tracks himself? Well, if you get the chance, compare this track where McCartney did the drumming against the various live versions available where he's not. The difference is very interesting. Without question, all the drummers that are playing on the live versions are more accomplished as drummers than Paul is. Paul, however, pulls it off in the studio version because he keeps his drums simple and he plays them to the song's strength. In other words, he lets the songs do the work for him. This brings us to side 2, track 6, Mamunia. Now, just like with Mrs. Vanderbilt, I will never stop being impressed with McCartney's knack for writing ditties. I'm talking about simple and catchy melodies that start to hook you right away. The song opens with a very pleasant chord modulation riff that is instantly enjoyable to listen to. Just like Can't Buy Me Love, Mamunia puts the chorus before the verse. And seeing as how the song opens with its title being sung 8 times in a row, you might think, well, there isn't a whole lot going on here lyrically. But on closer inspection, you will find that there is actually quite a bit more going on under the surface. The rain comes falling down from the sky to fill the stream that fills the sea. And that's where life began for you and me. So next time you see rain, it ain't bad. Don't complain it rains for you. Next time you see LA rain clouds, don't complain it rains for you and me. The song's title is supposed to mean safe haven in Arabic, but it was also the name of the hotel in Lagos, Nigeria, where the McCartneys stayed for the duration of their trip. Rainstorms were among some of the hardships and difficulties that the 3 members of Wings encountered during their stay. And in the song's lyrics, rain is a metaphor for rebirth and the adversity that life can throw at you. Reportedly, there was a rainstorm outside as they recorded the song too. Of course, as a teenager, I just always thought that Mamunia was code for marijuana. Track 7, No Words.
No words for my love.
No Words was written before the release of Red Rose Speedway, but not recorded till Band on the Run. It is the only track on the album to feature a writing credit for guitarist Denny Laine, as being co-written by Denny Laine, Paul, and Linda McCartney. It's also the only track where he takes a lead vocal, although he does trade off the lead vocals with Paul. There is also a fair amount of kitchen sink thrown into the arrangement of this track, probably about as much as was thrown into Band on the Run. And arrangement-wise, this track is pleasant enough to listen to, but I would have to say that No Words is the album's weakest track. In spite of its strong production, it seems to lack a strong melodic hook that holds it all together. It also sounds like it fades out too early during the guitar solo. It feels like it's missing an ending that should have come after the guitar solo. I would say that as a song it's pretty good, but it has nowhere near the kind of melodic satisfaction that every other track on Band on the Run has. Track 8, Picassos' Last Words, Drink to Me.
Drink to my health. You know I can't drink it.
This is where my opinions on this album get a bit complicated and honestly kind of tangled up. So first, let's give a little bit of backstory. McCartney was challenged by actor Dustin Hoffman to write this song. The story goes that McCartney told Hoffman that he could write a song about anything if he wanted to. So Hoffman pointed out a news item to Paul about artist Pablo Picasso's passing, and that his last words were, "Drink to me, drink to my health. You know I can't drink anymore." He challenged him to write a song about it, and was amazed to see him do it right there in front of him. Hoffman was heard exclaiming to his wife, "Look, he's doing it." Honestly, I would have been amazed to see him do it too. But I do think that the news article quote of, "Drink to me, drink to my health, you know I can't drink anymore," is pure lyrical gold, and that Hoffman couldn't have given a songwriter a better starting point if he tried. And none of this diminishes how I feel about the song. I really do like it. I especially like the shorter version on Wings Over America. But, and this is where my opinions get complicated and tangled, listening to the studio version there is something about it that has always really bothered and puzzled me. The shorter version, On Wings Over America, is only 1 minute and 54 seconds long, and it ends on a tension chord, played right after the Parisian-sounding instrumental break. The Band on the Run version is close to 6 minutes long. It reaches the same stopping point as the shorter version, On Wings Over America, but is then continued by a musical montage of the song's chorus sung over different musical style backdrops, with sections of Jet and Mrs. Vanderbilt added in as well. Side note. Now, Picassos' Last Words was actually recorded at Ginger Baker's ARC Studios in Ikeja, the capital city of Lagos. Ginger Baker invited Paul McCartney to record the entire album at his studio, but McCartney was reluctant and agreed to only 1 day. I'm going to venture a guess that McCartney was aware of Ginger Baker's reputation for being volatile, thus explaining his reluctance. Listening to the track, though, it feels to me like the first half, the same half performed for the Wings Over America album, is what they recorded at ARC Studio, and the rest was tacked on after they got back to England. By the way, I honestly don't know if Ginger Baker's studio is called ARC or ARC. I'm going with ARC. If you have anything against that, just put it in the comments. Listening to this track, it feels like the first half, and I'm referring to the same half performed on the Wings Over America album, is what they recorded at ARC Studio, and the rest was tacked on after they got back to England. I have nothing to back this up, but I would guess I am right. The first half sounds so authentic, and there is a romantic charm to it. The second half lacks any of this and just feels really tacked on. Listening to this, I am not sure what motivated the need to do this, but this montage feels completely out of place with both this track and with the rest of this album. And if I could have been in the producer's chair, I would have said, look, if you want this track to be a bit longer, then just repeat the chorus after that Parisian instrumental section and then bring it to a close. The producer in me thinks that the only way that this section could have even begun to work would be to include more musical references to the album's other tracks and then just put it at the end of the album. A reprise of sorts. But the problem with that is that the final track on Band on the Run has a reprise. And I will circle back to all of this in a moment, but first let's talk about the final track, track 9, 1985.
Never left alive in 1985 will ever.
Paul McCartney states that he started writing this song with the first line, "Oh, no one ever left alive in 1985 will ever do." Lyrically, it's an intriguing start, but the rest of the song's lyrics are about sex and desire and really have nothing to do with the opening line as far as I can tell. But again, it doesn't matter that much. Personally, I view the lyrics in 1985 as just a placeholder for the music. In fact, I feel this way about a lot of rock songs, especially from this time period. The lyrics might have some vague level of meaning, but they are mostly just there to facilitate the music, and honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. 1985 opens with a really cool rocking piano riff. And it builds up to a very cinematic and grandiose ending. It feels like the ultimate 70s action movie or TV theme show ever written. As album closers go, it's very strong. But then after it comes to a close, there is a brief reprise, callback to the title track. Doing this is perfectly fine, and it doesn't diminish the song in any way. But didn't the album already do a callback to some of its previous tracks on Picassos' Last Words? So we have two musical reprises that call out the album's previous tracks right next to each other. It's kind of like the album has two endings when all it really needs is one. Now, maybe this could have worked if Picassos' Last Words had ended side 1 and 1985 had ended side 2. Now, you may call me a nitpicker, but this aspect of the album has always just kind of bugged me. I'm sure right now that there are probably at least a few of you out there just seething right now at me, saying to yourself, who do you think you are advising Sir Paul about how to make an album? Well, I'm someone with an opinion. That's who I am. You don't have to agree with it, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this, even if you disagree with me. Just be civil and make a real argument for why you disagree versus saying something like, dude, you're whacked. I would love for these videos to be a place where we can really express our thoughts and even our differences. By the way, this isn't the first time I've suggested this sort of thing. I got really into this when I talked about Their Satanic Majesty's Request by the Rolling Stones. And again, I'll leave you a link if you're interested. Don't get me wrong, though. I love Band on the Run. I love it a great deal, even though I do have a few small issues with it. But now that we've reached the end, I want to share something. Band on the Run, as much as I love it, is not my personal favorite by Paul McCartney. My personal favorite is Venus and Mars. But all that said, Band on the Run was a huge success for Paul McCartney, and it's kind of become the standard bearer by which all of his other subsequent albums gets judged by, which is really not very fair in my opinion. But that's a topic for another day. These are my thoughts. Let me know yours. Please share them in the comments. As always, if you like these types of videos, please be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video. You can also show your appreciation by leaving a one-time super thanks or becoming a patron supporter and making a monthly pledge. Patron supporters do receive exclusive weekly videos not available on this channel. Mostly, though, I just want to thank you for taking the time to stop on over and listen to me talk about music. I love sharing my thoughts, but now I really want to hear yours. So let's fire up that comments section and let's start talking about this album. I'll see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.